Evening, we will be finishing chapter 19. A great preacher once asked a well-known actor how it is that when performers present a story, they often bring the audience to tears. Yet rarely does a minister move a congregation to such a degree. The actor responded that the performers portray fiction as if it is reality, whereas ministers of the gospel too often portray realities as if it is fiction. Listen to what Nobel Prize-winning American physicist Steve Weinberg said in a recent PBS interview regarding religion. I have very good friends who belong to religious denominations whose teaching is that since I don't accept their teaching, I am damned for all eternity. And you would think that these friends would try to convert me, but they never do. Now, you could explain this in various ways. It may be that they really don't like me very much and are just as glad to see me damned for all eternity. That's a possible explanation. But another explanation, which I tend to think is more likely, is that although they know what their church teaches, they give lip services to it. If we really believed that unregenerate souls were going to hell, we would preach with overwhelming passion. Our hearts would groan in constant prayer. We would run to sinners with solemn words of warning, take hold of them, and beseech them to turn from their sin. Instead, we lack any real sense of urgency. We are afraid to speak frankly with sinners about their personal sins. We think that searing them under the heat of the law will do harm rather than good. But consider how Jesus spoke with the woman at the well in John 4. He applied the heat of the law, verse 18, and spoke of her personal transgressions, and what was the result? She became an immediate laborer. Verses 28 through 29. I received a following letter about one of my books. It shows the power of the law to bringing a thirst for righteousness. This friend of mine has always told me for the last 8 years, whenever the opportunity popped up, that the law was finished with and that the 10 Commandments were basically useless. Of course, I tried to gently suggest that the knowledge of sin could not come by any other way than the law, but this was always smothered in a sugary reference to love and grace, so I kept quiet. But I stuck my neck out last week and gave the book to this friend, and the next day he handed it back to me. He was crying and shaking with emotion. He could hardly speak. He said, I just been born again. What really happened, I think, was the full impact of the power of God's law had struck him and wounded him, showing him clearly how bad his sin really was. He was in quite a state for several days after that, and kept breaking out into praise to God. It was the 2 tablets of the law that caused the mourning in his heart. 7 scared sinners. Late in 1994, I arrived in Baton Rouge to do a series of meetings. A young man named Jeff picked me up and told me of the plan he had for me to speak open air at a fake funeral. After a short nap in my hotel, I met with the others, briefed the pallbearers, the corpse, and the crowd as to the do's and don'ts of an open-air setting, and we drove to the site of the preaching. When we pulled into the parking lot of a Walmart, I thought we were going to buy something, but it was actually the location Jeff had chosen for us. After I had preached for about 5 minutes, one of the security guards approached me and said I could speak for another 5 minutes. Then I had to stop. I was thankful for the extra time and afterwards mentioned this to the local pastor who had come with us. He smiled and said, When you started, I told the security guard, see all those people around the preacher? They go to my church, and we all shop at Walmart. After that, we drove to an area near the local university campus and set up the funeral once again. This time, Jeff had decided he would give my voice a break by preaching himself. Just as we were organizing the pallbearers, a siren shrieked behind me. I turned to see a traffic officer on a motorcycle angrily waving over a van full of teenagers. As the van pulled to the side of the road, the police officer jumped off his bike, ran to the van, opened the door, and cursed the driver. He then grabbed him violently, pulled him out of his seat, and thrust him against the vehicle. The officer then gave him a body search, once again using obscenities as he did so. The scared youth didn't resist as he was frisked and yelled at. From what I could gather, the officer had waved the van over and they had failed to stop. Some of the passengers in the van had thought the incident funny, which had caused the officer to boil over. Here was a wrath-filled, slightly out-of-control officer of the law, God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Romans 13:4. We decided that it wouldn't be wise to preach there with the law so upset, so we moved to the entrance of a bar about 30 yards away across the parking lot. While Jeff preached, semi-drunken teenagers came out of the bar and mocked him. It was a reply in the spiritual realm of what I had just seen in the natural realm. These teens were refusing to listen to the law, and they were storing up wrath that would be revealed on the day of wrath. The day would come when an angry law would pull them from the seat of the scornful, and from that there would be no escape. After about 5 minutes, the manager came out and stopped Jeff from preaching. The local church members didn't patronize his bar. As we wandered back to the van, we passed the youths the officer had stopped. I went over to the group and asked what had happened. The driver was obviously still upset and told me that he had driven through a stop sign and his lights out and had failed to stop when the officer first waved him over. His 6 friends who were with him were also shaken by what had taken place. I couldn't help but sympathize a little with the driver and shared how I thought the officer had clearly lost control of himself. He agreed. I wanted to witness to them, but felt I lacked the right approach. It would be like putting salt on the wound of a distressed child. I was sure that if I mentioned sin, righteousness, and judgment at that point, I would be told in no uncertain and colorful terms to depart from the area. Reluctantly, I simply said I would see them later and walked back to our group. As I stood there, someone asked if I had witnessed to them. I said I hadn't. I said I didn't know how to approach the subject and that I needed a little more time to get some thoughts together. A moment later, I walked back to them, determined to say something about their eternal salvation, even if I did get abused. Suddenly, I remembered that I had put about $10 bills in my wallet to give away at the open-air presentation, something I often do to illustrate a number of points. When I asked how much the fine would be, the driver looked up and said about $200. I took my wallet out, pulled out a handful of bills, and said, This isn't much, but I would like to give this towards the fine. As I referred to the money, I looked down at it in amazement. Clearly visible was a $10 bill, making the wad of bills look like far more than it was. It looked like a fortune. Different teens in the group said, "Wow, you can't do that. That's really nice of you. You don't even know us." The driver graciously declined the money, but the offer struck a chord in their hearts. They could see that I really cared about them, and the suggestion had given me license to speak to them about their salvation. I said, "I'm a preacher. Here is a gift for each of you." I then handed them each a penny with the 10 Commandments pressed onto it, and asked if they had kept the law. When I asked if they had lied, stolen, lusted, etc., every one of them admitted that they had broken the commandments. Then I turned to the driver and asked if he was scared when the law enforcement officer pulled him from his vehicle. He said he was terrified. I then said, "Tonight you transgressed civil law, but now you know that you have also transgressed the divine law. If civil law scared you, wait until you face God on Judgment Day. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." I explained the gospel, asked if they had Bibles, and told them to dust them off and read the Gospel of John. I then shook their hands and thanked them for listening and left them in the hands of a faithful Creator. While I had been speaking, the driver was peeling masking tape from around his ankles. He had strapped sealed plastic bags of whiskey under his socks, something the officer hadn't found when he frisked him. God only knows what may have happened that night if the driver had downed the whiskey and driven home with 6 drunken friends in his van. The officer of the law missed that hidden offense, but God's law won't miss a thing. Both the civil and the divine law did a deep work in some young hearts that night. It is my prayer that 7 streaks were seared to a crisp, and that someday even tender-hearted and faithful laborers will enter the harvest field and happily toil for their masters. Kirk's commentary. The information in the next chapter is what really lit a fire in my heart, to abandon my comfort zone and reach out to the lost. Now, okay, thank you for listening. God bless you. Goodbye.